Hi everybody, welcome back. Today I just wanted to give you a quick little overview, review, touch up on the National Savings and Investment Identity. This is important for understanding the interaction between international trade, capital flows, and government policy, but it is a little bit confusing and it can be a place where students get stuck. And because it does come up again later on when we're talking about things like fiscal policy and the long-term effects of them, and because it can be really important for understanding implications of public policy and what happens when we alter things, I think it does a really nice job of kind of showing the interconnectedness of the national economy. So I thought it'd be really good to go through and just review it quickly. And so we're just going to kind of do a quick overview of what the National Savings and Investment Identity is, what it says, what it means, and just sort of the ups and downs of it. And really, it's trying to be simple, but it's a little bit of alphabet soup. And alphabet soup is what I call it when we have a bunch of letters that we have to remember what they all mean, right? So with the National Savings and Investment Identity, we have a couple of different things. We have S, which is savings, and this is generally meant to be savings by individuals, households, firms. This is what we call private savings, and that's savings by private companies, private households, private citizens, right? People, you and me. You put money in a savings account, it goes into what we consider sort of the larger market for financial capital. We also have I, which is investment. And investment is, for our purposes, going to be domestic, and that's going to be anytime anybody in the private sector borrows money, right? So if you are borrowing money to start a new business, buy a car, build a house, expand a business, that's going to show up here in investment expenditure. So this savings is private saving, and this is investment is private borrowing. And then we have G, which is government expenditure. Oops. Forgot the MEN, government spending. Money that the government spends, and this is the same as what we see in our GDP identity, right? G is government expenditure. It's the same here, so that's not changing, so that's kind of nice. And then we also have T, which is our tax revenue. And this is not only taxes, right? The government does collect revenue that's not just taxes, but this is a nice kind of overview of just all of the government income, right? What kind of money the government brings in. Well, this is the money the government spends, or what we call government outlay. And then the last thing we have in here is net exports, our imports minus exports, our trade deficit or our trade surplus. And so we can call it M minus X for a trade deficit, or X minus M for a trade surplus. But the big idea here is that it is our imports minus our exports. It's our balance of trade. Does that kind of make sense? So really what we're looking at is the money coming in and out and moving around our country. We're looking at all the money being saved either by the government here or by households here, and then all the money being borrowed by private entities here or by the government. And so what we're going to see is these two things, government spending and government revenue, are going to end up coming together to be our budget deficit or our budget surplus. And so what the textbook will do, and what we'll often see in books and in slides and when people talk about this, is they'll order G minus T or T minus G, depending on whether it's a deficit or a surplus. But we know intuitively that, hey, if you are spending more money than you're making, you're going to have a deficit. You're going to be having a negative number in your account. And that's really how we want to think about this. Is the government making more than it's spending or spending more than it's making? That will give us whether or not we have a government budget deficit or surplus. Is that a positive number or a negative number? And real quick, let me just show you a quick example of this. I was looking this up for fun. And for an example in class. Let me pull this up and I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so over here, what I've got is I've pulled up the monthly Treasury statement from the U.S. Department of Treasury. And so they put these out on a monthly basis and give us a report of just sort of an accounting of the money that the government is spending and the money is making, the G and the T. And I just think that's kind of cool to look at the real numbers and also know that this data is out there and available to all of us. So here's the summary. We are not going to read the whole thing. I just thought it'd be fun to look at this. So here we see for just the month of June, the receipts. So we see we've got individual income tax, social insurance and retirement expenditure, money coming in from corporations, coming in from duties and excise taxes. These are going to be monies that are coming from maybe purchases in other countries, estate taxes and gift taxes, money that is taxed on exchanges and transfers of wealth within the country, and then miscellaneous. And so that's all the money that our government received in June of 2025. That's $526 billion in June of 2025. And then our outlays for that same month are going to be here: Social Security, net interest, so paying money on our debt, healthcare expenditure, national defense expenditure, income, Medicaid, veterans benefits, transportation, education, other. And then here we could see there's a surplus, and it makes sense because this outlays is the government spending is $499 billion. The receipts are $526 billion. If we made $526 and we only spent $499, we have $27 left as a surplus. So that month we ran a budget surplus. If we scroll down, though, we see that the overall trend is not that way. Like we've kind of said over and over again in the textbook, slides, lectures, all of this, the U.S. tends to run a budget deficit and a trade deficit. And that's the whole point here, is that those things are connected, and we can see it over here in part with the receipts to date. So this is for the fiscal year of 2025. We're coming up to the end of the fiscal year, and we could see that the U.S. government received $2 trillion in individual income taxes, about $1.3 trillion in social insurance and retirement, about $366 billion in corporate taxes. So again, the majority of the revenue the government gets is from individual income taxes. Duties here, excise taxes, miscellaneous, and estate taxes and gift taxes. And then here we see that deficit that shows us that our outlays are larger than our resources, our revenue. So the government is spending more than tax. So what we would say there is, I'll go ahead and pop this up on my little chart. I think you'll be able to see this here, right? So in this case, we have T is equal to $4 trillion, oops, give or take, and G is equal to $5.3 trillion, or 5,346 billion. And so that means that if we're looking at the budget deficit, that's going to be T minus G, which is the 4 trillion minus the 5 trillion, gives us a deficit of $1.3 trillion. Does that make sense? So that's the real numbers for the U.S. government for 2025. So how does that figure in with trade? Let me close this down. Hold on. So when we put these all together, what we're going to see is that Because we're not in a closed system, we're not an isolated economy, we can compensate for that deficit that we tend to run or the surplus that we ran for the month of June. And that's where this national savings and investment identity comes in and how it relates to international trade, capital flows, all of that. You'll see it in exchange rates too. And the idea there is that we have our private savings, S, plus our net exports equal to our investment dollars plus our government budget. And I ran out of space there. That's embarrassing. I hate that. Let me try it again. So that's where we kind of start off, is this idea that they are balancing each other. And so on one hand, we have domestic savings. And the idea here is that this net exports is going to include investment in our country. So it's the savings that comes from domestic households, but also savings and investment that might come from foreign entities. And that's going to counterbalance the private investment that we're seeing, the demand for financial capital in this country, and whatever the public savings is, the G minus T here. And so we kind of want to think about the idea, right, that this is our net exports up here. And this is our government budget. That color showing up a little bit. Not really. Sorry. And then this is investment and savings on the private side. Where it gets interesting is when we start to look at the idea that we're going to have to balance this with a budget deficit and some component of trade. So if we think about it this way, if we have a government deficit, right, the government is spending more than it's taking in, that means that G is going to be bigger than T. Government spending is bigger than our tax dollars, and that's going to mean that public savings by the government, is zero, or is negative, actually. And so if public savings is negative, then our government is going to be in debt, right? Just like if I am. If I make $5,000 in a month and spend $6,000, where is the extra money coming from? It's debt. So this government debt is going to be purchased by either domestic savers, people in this country who are saving money, either by buying government bonds or something like that, or by foreign savers. And that's where the net exports part comes in. And so we can think of this as being the divide between savers and borrowers. And over here, the government ends up being a borrower because their savings is negative. Does that kind of make sense? And that's really what we're doing with all of this. Is the rest of this discussion about this is kind of saying, okay, well, you know, if this goes down, then something over here has to change, because we can't have everything be the same and this still be equal. So one of the questions on the homework quiz, if the government deficit gets bigger, right, G minus T gets lower, then we're gonna need to see something happen over here. Either we have another thing come down over here, one of these goes down, or this goes up to balance it out. Does that kind of make sense? The other way that you can look at it is reorganizing this to look at it from the perspective of a trade deficit or a trade surplus. And it really is truly just moving everything around to kind of show it in a different way. So if we have it from the perspective of a trade deficit, then we're going to have our imports minus our exports be negative because we are importing more than we're exporting. But that's going to have to be equal to that private investment minus private savings minus public savings. And we can write it either way. In the textbook, it goes T minus G. But the idea is just keeping track of whether these numbers are positive or negative. And so this way, if we have negative public savings, then to have any kind of investment, it's going to have to be coming from abroad. Does that kind of make sense? And so you just want to think about the idea that whatever you've got in this equation, this equal sign means that these have to be balanced. And so if I make this negative part bigger, then either this has to get bigger too to counter it, or this has to get bigger too to counter it over here. Oops. Right? We have to balance the equation. And there's a table that kind of goes over this in the textbook, but that's really what we're doing here, is just trying to balance private savings and public savings with government or with money from outside. And it can be foreign countries, it can be private savings domestically, it can be individuals abroad, but that money has to come from somewhere. And so it's kind of this question of who does the US borrow from? And real quick, I'll just pop it up and show you. I put this in because I thought this was interesting. I'll link these in the comment section, but this is a cool place to look at who borrows from the US, or who the US borrows from rather. Sorry, give me one sec. So this is an article from Reuters. I tend to like them pretty well as a media outlet, and also their sources are really good. So you can kind of see that here as I show you what we look at. This is from February 2025, who owns US debt, and these things do fluctuate over time because people are going to be buying and selling this debt over time, but it shows that the US does have $36 trillion, give or take, in public debt. That G minus T, right? That public savings is negative $36 trillion. Of it, about 55% are U.S. investors and U.S. holders, households, firms, retirement funds, right? Your 401k might be invested in U.S. debt. 24% are foreign investors. The Federal Reserve holds 13%, and then Social Security and other agencies will hold that debt because interest is paid on it. So it's an investment tool, right? It's a way to make some money. And you can see right here, like I said, I like this because their sources are good. So they're using the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury and the Bureau of Fiscal Service. So those are great sources for data. So that tells me that this data is reliable. The foreign owners of debt, so of the 24% of the debt that's owned by foreign investors, it tends to trade off between Japan and China. Japan has been holding it for a while now as the greatest holder of U.S. debt, then followed by China, the UK, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands, Canada, Belgium, Ireland, France, Switzerland, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Brazil, Norway, Saudi Arabia, South Korea, Mexico, Germany, and the rest of the world. And again, this data is mostly from the U.S. Treasury and from U.S. custodians, assembled by Tom Westbrook down here. And so this means that these countries own debt, right? Loans, basically, usually in the form of treasury bills or treasury bonds or something like that, that are debt issued by the U.S. government to help pay for its ongoing budget deficits and its debt. And then down here, you can kind of see how the size of the ownership is, and by investors, so in US dollars, Japan holds about $1 trillion in US debt. China only holds about 768 billion, and so on. And then here we can see the rise in debt over time, the ballooning US debt that we see over this period of time. You can see it flatten out here. In the early 2000s, the U.S. was actually running a budget surplus, so we were not accumulating more debt. We weren't adding to the total debt, but then that flipped around when we had a financial crisis. And you can see big spikes in debt when we tend to have financial crises, because those usually mean reduced revenue and increased expenditure. So I just thought that was a great little resource and a great way to kind of look at how that debt works. But the idea here is that, each session of, and I can even pull it up here, if we look at the Federal Reserve U.S. budget deficit, you can see over time that these deficits have, right? We had balanced budgets over some periods. Here we have a deficit in the mid 1940s, and then we had periods of minor surplus in the 70s, and then a deficit in the 70s and 80s. Here's that surplus I spoke of in the early 2000s, 99, 2000. A little baby recession knocked that back down. And then you can see massive increases in the federal deficit during the Great Recession and during the pandemic. A little budget bump up to a lower deficit in 2022 and then back down in 2024. And so that's going to be what's driving those numbers. That's what's going to be driving that accumulation of negative public savings or negative debt, that budget deficit. Does that make sense? Hopefully that helps you understand a little bit about how all of this works. The last thing I'll show you really quickly is another way to think of this is that we have this total market for loanable funds, right? If this is the market for loanable funds or financial capital, then there's going to be a cost to borrow associated with it, the interest rate. That's the cost of borrowing money and the benefit of saving. So if I want to save money, I'm going to be more inclined to put my money in a bank account if interest rates are high. So we're going to have an upward sloping supply, and that's going to be people who are savers putting their money into that account. So that's going to be this S right here. And then we're going to have a downward sloping demand for loanable funds because people are going to demand a very small amount of loans when interest rates are high, but as interest rates go down, we'll be more willing and able to borrow. And so that demand for loanable funds is going to be driven by people who are borrowing, usually for investment. And it's all fine and well, and we have our quantity of loanable funds down here and some equilibrium quantity and equilibrium interest rate. But what we need to remember is that the government plays a role too. So we have, right, our private savers and our private borrowers, investors, but we also have the role of the government. And if the government is running a deficit, then they're going to be borrowers also. So they're going to be demanding more loanable funds, raising up interest rates and crowding out private investors. And where's this extra money going to come from? Well, it's going to come from, in many cases, according to that national identity, foreign investors who are willing and able to say, wow, since interest rates are so high, there's such a nice return on that US debt. I would love to buy some of it and make money off of it. And so that's another way of thinking about it. But it all has to even out. And that's kind of what the big takeaway is from that identity. So hopefully that helps it make a little bit of sense. Like I said, I'll link the Reuters article, the Treasury report, and the Fred graph on surplus and deficits in the description below. Let me know what other questions you have, and I'll see you next time.